So in this video, we're going to install SQL Server and start looking at the SQL Server database stuff and then working our way into Entity Framework. So the first thing we'll do is actually Google for SQL Server Developer Edition, and we will then go and download and install this. So it's free for developers, obviously not for commercial applications. You can get different versions, but for our sakes, we want the developer version. So just search Google and look for, we should find the download link fairly easy. That's probably going to be in the one down here that I've just spotted, but let's see if this one takes us to it first. No, let's go back one. SQL Server downloads, that should definitely be the one. There we go. So Developer Edition, just click this middle one, and that will save this downloader. Run the download and install. And then I'll guide you through this setup. So we can have a basic one. I think the installer is a lot easier now. So let's just go with basic. Accept the license, install to that location, that's fine. And usually the previous installers, just before this one, were a lot more complicated. It wasn't as simple as just clicking an install button, but I think they've massively improved the new installer. But this is the first time I've run the latest installer in a while, so we'll see how this goes. That's why I'm doing it from scratch to see the experience we get. So I'll just let this download, and then we'll resume the video in a minute once this is downloaded. It shouldn't take more than a minute, I'd say, at the internet speed I've got. Okay, so that's downloaded, and now it's just checking the download. Now we should be installing. Okay, so that was pretty simple. In fact, it's the simplest install I've done of SQL Server. It looks like it's just installed in about 5 minutes. It's then gives us these options here for, I guess, the connection string. It's already installed. This is telling us the connection string now. So we have a version localhost, and there's a default database called master, I'm guessing. It's telling us where the logs will go, where the installation media is in case we want to reuse it. So I'm guessing I'll have a C drive SQL media there. So that was the downloaded files, I guess, if you want to keep a 1.6 gig, which I will delete in a minute. And then the version. So this is also what I was going to install next, is SQL Server Management Studio, which you need to actually visually interface with the database. So the computer needs a restart to complete. That's fine. We'll do an install of this first. So this is actually going to just take us to a download link by the looks of it. So now the server's installed on the machine. That's fine. You can close this. In order to actually then see the database, you could do it in code, but obviously a much better way is to visually be able to interface with it. So it's taken us to this link. I'll put this in the video anyway. You just want to download the SQL Server Management 17.4. And then this is a slow link. So once this is downloaded, we'll run the installer. Okay, that's downloaded. Let's just install that. I'll also delete that media that we downloaded. That was the install for the other. And I did click this. This should be spinning up. I think it takes a while once you've double-clicked the exe. I think it does take about 15-20 seconds off the top of my head. It's extracting this 800 meg, and then you just have to be patient. It looks like nothing's happening, but I'm sure this will kick in a minute with the installer. So we'll just give it a second and make sure this pops up. Okay, so this is the installer for the Management Studio, and this is like the front end to, like I say, connect to instances of servers. In this case, we'll use it to connect to this machine's SQL server. So there's just a simple install button, and then I guess that's it. It'll just install and we can run it. I will just restart the computer before running this, though, because it did mention in the SQL Server install that the machine requires a restart. So once this is installed, I'll see if we can connect, but then I'll also just quickly restart the computer to make sure everything's fresh and ready to go, and then we'll carry on with the interfacing with the database, and we'll have a play at making some databases and connecting to them through code and everything else. Okay, that's that installed. So we'll close that installer. Don't need that anymore. It's still in use at the minute. I'll have to give it a second. We should be able now to find SQL Management, and I love how inaccurate Windows Start menu is. It can never find what's in the menu. So it's right there. So we'll just click this one. Should be able to delete that now. Nope. Okay, we'll delete it when we restart. So this should spin up the SQL Server Management Studio. And then we'll get into this first. We should be able to connect now because this is enabled on my machine and Windows authentication is enabled by default. So it looks like we can actually connect to the database, even though it says we need a restart, but we'll restart anyway now just to make sure it's fresh. So let me just pin this now to the taskbar, and then I'll close this down and just restart this machine, and then we'll carry on from there. Okay, so that's the computer restart. So if we open up SQL Server Management Studio, you see how this is grainy as well. See you might be able to see that on the video. The whole UI looks a bit pixelated. So all these little pixels here, and the text looks a bit blurry. Let's just fix that first. So just right click on the shortcut, right click again, Properties, Compatibility, override high DPI scaling and leave it to Application and click OK. And that should now allow the application to scale correctly. So now you can see that's all smoothed out. And hopefully the text when we open is all smooth. There we go, so that's nicer now. So when we've installed SQL Server, if we were to run or type services and open up services, if you're wondering where the server itself is, it's a service in Windows. So if you went to the services and typed S, you get to SQL Server. It's here is the server itself that's running. And the name is MS SQL Server. That's the instance name because you can have multiple servers on one machine. All these other bits are, to help discover it and to do tasks with it. You don't need to be concerned. This is your main task that's running. So we know this is now a server that's running. You've also got I think in the start menu you should find it maybe. SQL Server. You've got this configuration tool as well. Server Configuration Manager. And this is if you want to enable things like connecting remotely and things like that. So you make sure all these are enabled, which they are by default anyway. You can enable TCP so that you can connect to it remotely. But we won't be doing that in this video, but that's just there to be aware of. So the actual server itself is that service, and then this SQL Management Studio is basically like a front end, as I'm saying, and you can connect to any database. You don't have to connect to this machine. You can type in a database name of a database that exists anywhere in the world, and it'll connect. So by default, when we've installed it, though, it's on this machine. So therefore, you can connect to it with basically the name of the machine. You should also be able to connect to it with just dot as a name, and it should point to this machine as well. So either way, the name of the computer by default, or just dot to refer to this machine. There's multiple ways to connect. And the reason we've been able to log in automatically like that is because if we were to right-click and disconnect, and click connect, is because we've got Windows authentication, which means use this, this user on this machine, which is me, as the login. And once we logged in, if you go to security logins, you can see I'm here as a user. So if we were to double click on this user and go to, let's see, server roles, you can see I'm sysadmin, which means, control over the whole SQL Server. That's why we can do anything, and that's there by default. So whoever installed the program has the rights to the server. So that's all good, but what we want now is to enable SQL logins. So with users that we add that are specific to SQL, they're not on this machine, and that's what this SA is here as well. That's the SQL Server login, and that's the super user. But first we need to enable that kind of login, which I'm guessing isn't enabled by default. So if we right click on the server, click Properties, Security, and then there you go, SQL Server and Windows Authentication Mode. So we need to enable the ability to log into the server with something other than the Windows user accounts. So if we enable this and click OK, we can now log in with both of them. It's saying we've got to restart the server though to take effect. So to restart the server, if we were to type in services, go to here, as we mentioned, the SQL Server, and this is the server. So if we were to then restart this, which you can right click and click restart, this one I'll stop the server and restart the server. So that should do what we need to do. Then if we go to the logins, and this SA that's been created is disabled, that's what that little cross is. And we have a SA user, and we don't know the password because we haven't set this, and I don't know what it's installed it as. So I'm just going to create a password here. Not a super strong one, but okay for now. And then if we went to server roles, you can see this user is also super. It's a sysadmin. So that's what we'll leave it as, because this is meant to be the top level account. This is the one you want to keep secure. And then in status, we want to enable the login. And if we click OK, this user should become enabled. Might have to just click here and press F5 to refresh the list. And there you go, you can see it's enabled. So now it's enabled. If we were to disconnect from the server and go to connect, if we now change it to SQL Server and we type in SA as the user and the password I just made, you can see we can now log in as SA, which is shown here. So that's enabled SQL Server logins, and that's important because when we come to do C# and Entity Framework and everything else, you don't want to log in as a Windows user because this is going to be an ASP.NET website. You need to log in, as a user name that you specify. So that's the super user, but again, you don't want to really connect to super user for applications because they've got control over everything, not just one thing. So we'll come to that in a minute and we'll actually make a limited user. So let's just get started with some databases. So here you can see databases. These two are built in, these groups that show, built-in databases. We'll just ignore those. And for now, we'll create one. So if we right-click on databases and click new, and then we'll just call it test database. Or in fact, just call it test because we don't need to call it database. And just click OK, that's fine for now. And now we've got a database here, test. And you can expand it and you can see tables, which there's nothing. So there's, all the built-in ones are empty. Views we won't be bothered about for now. Security is the users that can access this database if they're specific, just to this database. Otherwise, then sysadmins can access everything, so they don't need to be in there. DBO means database owner. So if we specify a user as a database owner of this database, they can then do anything they like. But this is basically the database now. We've got a database called test. The tables, if we right-click and click new table, it'll open up a table designer. So let's just make, say, a user table. So we'll have an ID, so we'll type ID. And then we've got types. So in here, we'll talk about the types. And most of these, we only use a handful of. And I don't see any real, there's never really that many occasions where I need to do anything else. So we'll start here. The first one I'd use out of this list is be bit, and that's for a Boolean in code. So true or false is the way you'd think of that. Simply a single bit. The next, if you're using date times, I'd recommend date time offset. You should always use that now instead of date time. So if you're ever storing dates in a database, use date time offset. You've got decimal and floats, which are for high precision, ultra high precision, which is decimal, and high precision floating point numbers, partial numbers, not integers. So you'd use those for like doubles, floats, longs, not longs, doubles, floats, decimals. Going down the list next, integer for whole numbers. So I'd use an int. Then for text, I'd always use envar character, so a variable length character. And then this in brackets means the maximum size that it can be. So for the ID in this case, I'm going to actually leave that as 50. So it can be 50 characters long. Then we have real, which is again a high precision number, I believe. I rarely use that. All the rest, timestamp sometimes use for concurrency checking. Unique identifier I don't actually use. I tend to use envar with a GUID for IDs, but you could use unique identifier if you want an auto-incrementing ID in a database. And that's actually it. They're the only ones I use. So you can go and read up on all the different ones, but for now, there was like a super brief overview of what's what. So strings, characters, general text, envar, and you set the length to whatever. Booleans you want as bits. Dates, times you want as date time offset. Numbers you want as either float, decimal, or integer, or in some cases real. And that's literally it. There's nothing else to store. Enumerators in code are just integers. They store as integers. So we'll set the ID as an envarchar, which is basically a string. We don't want it to be null, so we'll uncheck this allow null. And then we can click the next one to make another one. Let's call this username. And again, we'll have envarchar, username maximum 50. That can't be null. We'll say first name. And again, we'll have 50 characters long. We don't want that to be null. Last name, same again. So this is a fairly boring looking database. We could say is enabled and set it as a bit, which is also non-nullable. So we know the user account's disabled, say. What else could we have? We could have created date, UTC for universal time, and we'll do date time offset, and that's also not nullable. And you could maybe have, say, last logged in date as a date time offset. And that can be nullable because they might not have logged in. So there's kind of a really simple database, or a table in a database. Control S to save, and then it'll ask us to give the table a name. So we'll call this users. And then in here, we click tables and press F5 to refresh. You can see we've now got a table called users. And there's the columns we made. One thing we didn't do in this that's important in databases is every table should really have a unique primary key, which is every row, if you will, in this table should then have some kind of key that makes it unique so that you can, always find that specific key. So that's what this ID column is for. But if we right click up here and click set primary key and then save, it will now be a primary key. So then you get this PK and this key next to it. And what that does in the database is it optimizes its ability. Well, it does multiple things. One is it optimizes, it indexes based on this ID. So when you try and search for a user with a specific ID, say, it's a fast lookup. And it also means it's unique. It's a primary key, which means you can't have two instances in a table with the same ID because then it's not a unique key. So we enable this primary key, and this should be on every table. You should always have some unique key in a table for good database design. And then I believe in here, you've got more options. We're not going to change any of those though. The other thing to consider, and again, I'm not going to dive too heavily into database design and optimization and things. This is just really an overview of SQL Server so that you're familiar enough that you can start using Entity Framework and know what's going on behind the scenes. It's a fairly high level and basic introduction. But one thing to keep in mind is that even though you make a primary key, this is automatically then indexed, which means it's going to look up faster. If you know on this database, you're going to always look up things, a certain column. Like in this case, we'll find users probably by the username, not by the ID that's going to be just a random long string. You're very likely to look up, say, a user by a username. Even though that's not going to be the primary key, because they can change the username, we want the ID to stay consistent. You do know you're going to search based on this username quite a lot. So what you can do is add this as an indexed column. So if you right click and click indexes keys, you can then click add and it'll say indexed keys. Is unique, you can say yes as well because we expect it to be unique. You don't want two users with two username, and the type is index, and that's it. Then we'll just change the name to indexed keys users username. Click close, click save, Control S, and then if we refresh that column, you don't really see any change there, but you can see if we go into keys. In fact, we don't see it, not keys. It will be indexes. You can see you have the index here. So that will just make it faster when you're doing the lookups in the database. But again, don't overly concern yourself about that type of thing. We're not going to need that because Entity Framework handles all that kind of setup for us for the most part, but it's just useful to know. So now we've got a table. You'd say, well, where's the data in it? How do I get the data? How do I look at what users there are? How do I add what users there are? So that's fairly simple as well. Click this table. If you already have this table selected, or any table inside this database here, if you're selected anywhere inside this database, when you click New Query, it's going to automatically be associated with this database. So we could then type in select star, which is select all, and that's not very clear, but have to do for now, the dark background with the blue text. So select star from, and then the name of the table, which is users. And you can see it's given us a bit of IntelliSense, so it knows. We press F5 to run that query. You can see the results down here are ID, username, first name. So the star is the columns to look at, which we've said just give them all of us, and which table with users. So this is how you kind of look up all the users in a database table. And you can see there's none. So before we can really make use of that, we need to add stuff to the table. So let's go ahead and add a user. So if we were to say insert into, which means, create an entry in a table, insert into users, then the next phase is the values. So we'd open and close brackets, or rather the columns. And then you'd do vals or values, and then it's in there. So insert into users, and then you'd have ID, username. So you're telling it which columns in which order. First name, last name is enabled. Created date UTC, which will be fun because I've got to now type that in a string command. And then the last logged in date will leave us null. So there we've told it to insert into the users table. We want to insert into these fields. And then the values now that we do, which I think I can put on a new line without it complaining too much, just so it's visibly easier to see. Kind of line them up. You'd see here, the ID then is a unique string. So let's just say, I know this is definitely not the unique string we'd use, but just so it's easier. So unique string, username, Angel6, first name, Luke, second name, Malpass, is enabled is a bit, so it's a 0 or a 1, or a true or a false. I think it's a true or a false, so we'll say true. I might be wrong in that. Let's just try 1. And then the created date now will also be interesting. Valid column name. Okay, let's ignore that for the minute. Oh, is it enabled, not in enabled. Yep, and then created date. Let's just Google for a created date string in UTC format. So I'll just say SQL datetime offset string example. Easier than trying to remember it. And that looks like we are going to have, give me a date anywhere. Example, come on, there we go. So let's just pick this random date. Really don't care. Paste that in. And then let's see what mistakes I've now made in this string, which I'm sure there's going to be a few. So if we then press F5, invalid column name, unique string. Okay, what have I done with? I think looking at it, it's just, I think you do single quotes in strings in the SQL strings. I think that's the only thing we've got wrong. Right, that's not complaining now. Let's press F5. Oh, and there we go. That's maybe worked. So we should have inserted. Let's just cut that so we can use it again. That should have inserted. You can see it says here 1 row affected. So if we now say select all from users, and let's see. There we go. So there's our created row in this database. So if we now do the exact same command again and try and insert the same value, we should get a complaint that violation of primary key constraint, cannot insert duplicate keys. So part of that primary key I was explaining, make sure that your ID, your primary key column, is unique. So let's put 2, and let's also see if this index key, being a unique index, is actually a constraint, because there's no technical constraints here. So let's just see if that allows us to make 2 users. So yes, you can see now, if we were to then do select all from users, you can see this constraint hasn't prevented that user. So we can fix that in a moment. So now we've inserted information into a database table, and we can select, let's say we want to delete this specific row. So all you do for that is to say, and we can leave these in and just highlight and press F5 so you can see each command. And then we can probably chuck that on a new line, maybe zoom out a little bit, bring that in. Hide the properties I don't care about. There we go. So now if you want to remove one, you'd say delete from users. Delete from users. What is the connection? Delete user. I think in fact it's just delete users, and then where ID equals, and we'll say unique string 2. If we now select this text, so I've highlighted that text, and press F5, it'll only run what I've highlighted. And you see now that said row affected 1, so that means if we run the select again, you can see the second column's been deleted. So this is how we select, this is how we insert, this is how we delete. If we now say insert a value of that as second one, we make a third one, and we make this one not enabled, and then we select. You should see now 3 users in the database. So as well as just selecting everything, we can do select everything still, as in select all the columns, but you can also then type where. So say we wanted only to get enabled users. You could say where is enabled equals 1. Now we to run this now, you can see it's only returned the 2 items that are enabled. I know this is really small text down here. I don't know whether I can get this thing to zoom in on the results one. But hopefully you can see that anyway. There's 2 results down here of the enabled ones. If you change it to 0, say, you get only disabled, you get the disabled user. So these are basic. This is called Transact, I believe, Transact-SQL, which is what we're writing here. This is how you kind of select and do things with the database. You can also, using the same language, you can actually create databases, and you can create tables, all from the same commands. You can do basically anything using this scripting language on a database. But these are your key, primary things to get you started. You're selecting stuff, you're inserting values. The star here is basically which columns you want to select. So you want to also keep in mind that you don't just want to go and select. This is usually what they say never to do. Never just select everything from a database table, because you want to specifically select just the information you need. So if you're looking for, say, when somebody's signing up to your website and you want them to see if their username is available, you don't want to do select all from users and then look for, or even select all from users where username equals, say, my username, and you're going to say you use this to check if a username exists, because then you've selected all this extra information. So one way to improve that would be just simply select, say, ID, or select any column. ID is the quickest one because it's a primary key. So instead of specifying star, you specify a specific column. So select the ID column where the username is Angel6, which should say unique string. So if we run that, you see you get just a single result back. And you can go further and optimize more, but again, I don't want to go too much in depth. I just want to give you the basic overviews. So in here you could say, select specific columns that you want results from, and you'll get just those columns. So we have selecting, inserting, deleting, and then this is kind of the filtering. So you can filter by strings, you can filter by values. So let's say we want to select all usernames that have EL in the name. You can do the same thing, but instead of saying where username equals, you can say where username like, which means simply contains this. So if we then say EL, and we want to select usernames where they contain EL, like, I know you have to do % either side, that's saying, the anything before, anything after, basically. And you can see there it's then kind of run an SQL filter searching for anything that contains EL in the username. Same thing you could say if last name like 3, which should find the user with the last name Malpass3, which it does. It then selects this one, which if we change it back to star, shows you, that's the one it selected. So I think that's enough for a really brief intro into SQL Server installation, connecting through this, and generally looking at your your database. So if we were to close that design, disconnect, you'd basically, to have a quick recap, you click the connect button, you connect to your database. I'll just jump back to Windows Authentication and jump in there. And then you have your database here. And then you go, I want to look at the tables. You can right click and I believe do right click on there. I'm sure you can right click on a table and select, there you go, it's like select top 1000s, which is the one thing I didn't mention as well. You wouldn't tend to also do select all, like as in you wouldn't just usually remove that and select this, because if this has got say 10,000 or more items, this select would select all of them and run everything. So you tend to do, if you wanted to select, simply check if something exists, you'd select the top one, and that would only ever return the first result. Or you'd limit it to a set amount of results that you want. That's what this top command does. So there's that as well. But all that should be, like I say, enough to get you going with at least creating a database, creating a table. If you want to allow a specific user to connect, which is what we'll do in a minute through code, we can first go to I believe you can go into the database itself and go to security users and add a user here. So right click new user, SQL login. So we'll say, I don't know, temp user. Login name is temp user. And if we go to own schemas, we want this to be the database owner. So we check that, and that means it can do anything with this specific database. Database role membership, own schemas DB owner, and membership will check DB owner as well. And that should be all. Click OK, exception. Okay, I don't usually create them there, so let's do it the normal way anyway. Create it at the top level in the server in this login. Right click new login, and then say temp user. SQL authentication, we'll type in temp user as the password. Enforce password expiration, no, we're not bothered for this one. Now you can see the default database here. We can change that to tempdb. In fact, it's not tempdb, it's test. So we should probably change that to test user actually. Test user, we'll get there in a minute. Test user, test user. And then if you go to server roles now, it's public, which means it has no access to anything specific. It's not a sysadmin and you don't want it to be. In user mapping though, we then want to map this user to the test database, and we want to make it a DB owner of this specific database. So that means that this test user, if we log in, will only see the test database and can only access and do anything with it. Securables is fine, it's all enabled. So we click OK. So that will create a new user. In here, you'll see now the user gets added automatically to the security of the database. So I guess when you go into here and you can add a user, you're basically going to be adding almost an existing user that it's simply going to find. So I was seeing if I could do it that way, but generally you don't. You do it from top level. So let's just make one more database, new database, another database. And this is just to prove the login user can only see this database. So now if we log out, because we're logged in as, as system admin, and we connect back to this server, but now we connect with the test user with the password test user. And you can see now we've logged in. Databases, we can see because we're public, but we can't access it. We can't do anything with it. So even though we can see that database, we know it exists. We've got absolutely no control. There's no plus arrow. There's no way to do anything with it. You can't see anything about it. You simply know it exists on the server, and that's due to that public permission. So it's only got permission to actually do anything with the test database, which is what we wanted. So we can still see the users, we can still select them and get the values. So now in code, we could use test user as the username and test user as the password and connect to this database and do those exact same SQL queries. So where we've been doing the queries in here, this is how you'd interact with it in C#. If you weren't using Entity Framework, you don't have to write them directly. If you were doing it through an SQL connection, you'll be able to now interface with this database. So let's go ahead and just do that so you can see how it works. So I'll spin up a new instance of Visual Studio and we'll make a .NET Core console app for this example. And this is actually the first time I've opened Visual Studio on this machine. I've just done a fresh install so we could do this SQL install video to make sure it's exactly the same from scratch. So that's why it's just taken a little while to start up for the first time. So now if we go to console app.NET Core as a new project, and we'll type in here SQL Connector, just as a, call it whatever you want. I'll just call it SQL Connector. And then before I forget, let me just bump up the font size. So present edit, I think it is. Go away, Visual GDB. Go away. Present edit. Let me just tweak this size. This is what I use to bump up the font size when I'm doing the videos. And now I can just do present on. So there we go, that font size should hopefully be legible for you. So we just got a console app. If we were to run this and put a breakpoint there, and then eventually when it does its first build, I think everything's just slow on the very first run. We hit that breakpoint and we should see here hello world. So we have a console app. So now let's make this one connect to that SQL database. So it's built into .NET Core, the ability to connect to SQL servers. So I believe we can do using var SQL connection equals new SQL connection. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I might get this wrong. SQL Server. SQL. Sure, it's SQL connection. Maybe SQL Server connection. I'm sure it is SQL connection. I'm positive of it. But I thought it was built into the .NET Core by default. So maybe not. Okay, let's go to Manage NuGet Packages. Browse. SQL connection. Probably come under SQL Server to be honest, but that's not that. SQL. Entity Framework SQL Compact, no. I know it's in where is it in? System data. That's usually there, SQL specific. So it's obviously in somewhere. I might have to Google where this is. Allows SQL Server Compact to be used. No. SQL. Okay, I think we're going to have to just Google where this is. Maybe Microsoft or system.data.sql maybe. Provides a data provider SQL Server. SQL client, maybe. See, I don't usually do it from a command line. I usually do it from like an ASP.NET app. Let's go ahead and install this one. Let's see if we get it. It's looking semi-promising, so might be that. But I did think this was baked directly into the .NET Core without having to have a NuGet package, but maybe not. Where did that come from? There, maybe. Right, so with that installed, do we have SQL connection? No, really? Oh yeah, we do. So you have to install the system.data.sql client package to get this far. So that's good to know. So now we make a connection. In the connection, you'll see you want to pass in a connection string. So the next thing is, how do we connect to our database that we just made? So simplest way is we type in SQL connection strings. You should see a website that's called something like connectionstrings.com. And then here, then you don't need to remember them. Like I said, you don't need to know these off the top of your head. You can just quickly Google it. SQL Server 2016. I believe we're on 17. Not that the connection strings changed, so we can click. We'll go with 16. And then standard security. So what you have here is the server name, which will be the dot or the local host or the machine name. So we'll just go with the dot. Database is the database you want to connect to. So that will be the test database. User ID and password is if you're using the SQL Server username like test or SA that we made, which is what we'll use. If you wanted to use the Windows login, like your username, then you specify this trusted connection. That's what this thing means. It means to use your Windows login and you don't have to provide, the connection details. So we will basically just copy this one here and paste it into here. And then we will change the server to dot to mean this machine, the database to test, the user to test user, and the password to test user. That should connect us to the database. Then we can do, we need a command, an SQL script to execute. So that will be a new SQL command. We should be able to pass in the command text. Let's just say select all from users like we've done before and pass in the connection that we have so it knows which one to use. And I believe we might be able to do using on that if it needs disposing. There we go. And now the command you want to run, so you can do execute. Now there's multiple ways to execute. Execute scalar basically returns the number of rows that were affected, or rather the first column of the first row. So it's a single item. It's expecting to return a single item. You can use it if not and just get the first item, it doesn't matter. Execute reader allows us to read multiple rows, and that's what we want to do. We want to read out each user. So I'll say execute reader, and that returns as a reader. So we'd say var reader equals that. And again, I believe that's a disposable. So I could check, but if I just simply wrap it in a user, it'll tell me if it's not disposable anyway. So there's the connect to the database, create the command that we want to run, execute the command, and now in here we can finally read the results. So if you look at the reader, we'll have, let's see what we have. So you can get specific values, or if the known types, then you can get them. You can get has rows, you can get read. Advances to the next record. So I believe execute reader will already read the first result, but we'll soon find out. And then you can do, I believe, brackets on it to get the name of a column, because you can use it like an array. So it gets the value of the specified column in the native format of the given column. So we could say get username, which we know is a string. So we could say var username equals that. Then we could say, we could wrap this. And in fact, I think you do have to do read maybe. So we'll soon know. So if we do while reader.read, which returns true or false. So it's capable of reading another line, then we get the info here. So if we put a breakpoint, there, and let's step through and press F5. Let's first check if this works. So we go to a connection, it's good so far. Make a command, execute the command, and we now fail here. Requires an open connection. So obviously my memory isn't that great. We want to actually do SQL Connection open to actually open the connection to the database. And I should be commenting this as well. I will comment it after, but this is just to quickly show you and make sure it works. Open the connection, create the command, execute the command. So far, so good. So now the reader, we could hover over and let's inspect and see. So we've got 7 fields, got a connection, and that's really all we can see. So I'm presuming we have to read first, and the reads failed apparently. So we have no results. So that's interesting. So selects all from users. We have the test database. So let's check. First, let's just jump into here. Check I've named everything. So that's test, we know that. We might need to prefix it with DBO because we're using the actual commands. It's not presuming. We've got no environment set up that's prefixing DBO for us. It could also be that we've read past. There we go. So we've got to add this is the schema. So because we haven't, inside SQL Management Studio, you've already got kind of built-in schemas. It knows because we selected this database here when we clicked new query, it's already presumed that schema and kind of added it to our SQL command without us needing to. Whereas inside C#, we have no presumption, we've got no schema. So we have to be very explicit and say it's dbo.users, which is technically the name of the table here. So therefore, we've got that result. We get the username, which is Angel6. We read again. We get the next username, Angel6. And then we get the next username, Angel63, and then it should pass over. So that's now working. We're reading the content. So we could then output this to the console. We could say console.writeLine. And we could output username. And we don't need to do our string because in this case, the natural dollar here will convert all these to a .to string either way. So it'd say username, first name, last name, and then we could say is enabled. And here you could do is enabled, which is a Boolean. It should come through as a Boolean. Let's just run that and see first. And we're going to now also open and close really quick because we didn't put a breakpoint. Just do a console.read. So any key pressed will close, but initially this will just open. So we see that it opens, connects, and dumps out. And it's by default a Boolean anyway, so it's already converted. So there's us reading the database. We can also do the opposite, and we can inject in there. So if we wanted to change this to, say, add a record, it's obviously as simple as doing the correct command. So in fact, that's the wrong place to do it. We would say, take this code here, paste it, and we could say, insert into users, or in this case, dbo.users ID, and then blah, blah, blah. I've got to write all this out again now because I closed down the query from the last time. I should have kept that open. First name, last name. In fact, we can make this a little bit quicker. Is enabled. Created date UTC is the only one I don't like doing, but we can pull that in. So we insert into all those values, and then this is where we do the ID something else, and again that'll probably be a GUID. Typically you'd have we did this, hide that. We could do GUID.new GUID.toString, and if we were going to do that, that's typically what you do, insert an actual GUID each time. Then we would have the username, so we just say username1, my first name, my last name, is enabled is 1, we're going to enable, and finally we want the date time. So I'll just cut that code for the moment. In fact, let me just chuck it in Notepad. Run this again because I just want to copy the date time, which I think is actually going to output the wrong, we haven't output the date time. Just quickly change this to created date UTC, and hopefully it's going to output as a UTC string, which I'm betting it won't. Oh, there we go, that'll do. So copy that string for the minute, paste it into our string there, cut all this back. So there we now have a command that should insert a user with username1, my first name, last name, and then all we need to do for that is execute non-query. And that just means it's going to execute this command and it's going to return a number of how many rows were added. So this execute query should result in 1 because it should have added one thing. So if you wanted to kind of check in code if that was correct, then you would check that result as 1. So if we now put a breakpoint here, and we run, insert into, and then execute, and the result's 1. So now when we finish and carry on, this should output now all the users. So there's username 1 that we added, and you can see it's got added there. Now I know, obviously, I've changed this to created date instead of first name. And then we'd have to just comment this out a minute so it doesn't run again with the exact same values. And you see now that's in the database. So you can see it's there. And likewise, if we were to jump into here and do select all from users, we should see that user is in here with a unique ID and all the values. So whatever you do in here, in a SQL command, which is called Transact-SQL if you want to read up more, you can also do in code here. And this is kind of how you would interact in C# with an SQL database. Now, there's obviously a lot of things in here. This is purely demo code, so you wouldn't put the connection string and username and password directly in code. You'd put it in a configuration file. You'd have a lot more logic in terms of making sure it's correct, try catching any connection errors, all that lot. But that's nothing to do with, specifically to just seeing how you connect to SQL servers. So the point of this video is to really give you an overview and enough to install SQL Server, open it, create databases, add users, insert stuff, delete stuff, generally play with SQL Server so that you can get a feel for what's going on. And then in future videos, so the very next video we do will be Entity Framework. The reason I've done this behind SQL Server stuff is because you won't actually need to do any of this when you use Entity Framework. So all we'll be doing is making classes in C# and then saying save. And it will save them to a database. It will handle all the conversion. It will handle all the unique IDs. It will make all the connections between tables. It'll kind of do all that for us. But you want to have the basic understanding, at minimum, the basic understanding of SQL Server. So this is the starting point to get you going. And I'll do more videos on SQL as the time comes and as it's needed. But like I say, when we actually do Entity Framework, you won't need to know that much SQL. You need to know enough that when you're doing commands in C# that effectively pull information from the database, that you don't just do things like database.users.toList, which would be similar to doing basically this, select all from users, which means just select absolutely everything and then go in .where f.username equals angel6. Because what you've done there is then pulled the entire database, all the users, all the details, and then in code in memory filtered by this. Instead, you'd actually do users.where_username.toList or whatever you'd want. So you'd know that then you're constructing, by using Entity Framework, this would construct a SQL statement that would be a lot more specific. It would do that where clause that would explicitly find just that user and then give the information out. So you need to know the SQL in order to then understand Entity Framework and make the correct choices when you come to write, specific code in Entity Framework. You can't just be completely oblivious to SQL Server. And we'll also install SQL Monitor from Redgate to actually inspect these Transact-SQLs that Entity Framework generates and fires for us. And then I'll show you how and why you'd use them and, to make sure you're making the right choices. But hopefully this video has been a good introduction to SQL Server and enough to get you, started messing with SQL Server, and then you can make your own learning from there if you need to before I do future videos. And then we'll jump straight into Entity Framework now, and you'll be able to then visually see this happening. You'll be able to open up SQL Server Management Studio and see the database created and things getting added. You'll have the knowledge now to at least keep an eye on what's really going on in the back end. Any comments or questions, as usual, you leave them in the video and I'll get back to you. But hopefully this was useful. And then we'll see you on the next video.